Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at July with a video. Well, as you can see, I've got my new mic working. Now, little thing, my upload schedule may be completely out of fucking order as of right now. Now, you're probably wondering why the very apparent drop in video quality. That's because I have to use my laptop because my phone, for whatever reason, just will not work with this thing at all. No matter what I do, no matter what I try. And with this mic on, I'm able to talk at a normal volume without having to scream my damn head off. So, that's that. Now, this video is concerning the Witcher's fighting style video that I made a little while back. I'm going to attempt to turn over here as to have more light so that we can track the blade easier. Now, you may be wondering, Outlaw, this is about witchers who stereotypically use European style swords. Why do you have the Warrior O Katana out? Well, I don't really feel like the Witcher's sword style works with the type of swords that they're using. For the simple fact that let me think for a second. Hard to think with all the frogs and cicadas, but for the simple fact that the swords lack the proper weight distribution. And what I mean by that? Well, as we see with the Warrior O, it has a very thick spine and a relatively thick blade. What this means is that when this sword is swung, the forward weight of the sword wants to pull it down. And with just a simple turn of the wrists, we can bring the blade back onto point, as exampled here. Same as the Witchers. The Witcher's very flamboyant fighting style comes from, as I mentioned in the previous video, the fighting styles that were utilized with the great swords of Europe. Montantes, Zweihanders, Claymores. These very large, powerful, imposing weapons. And because of that, while the Witchers do have very flamboyant fighting styles, the blades that they are using are not conclusive to those types of styles. Because as we see here, the Witcher's swords are much like the hand and a half sword from Cold Steel. This sword would not look out of place on the back of a Witcher. Or, for that reason, medieval Europe as a whole. And while it is true that this sword is more nimble and easy to recover from, it doesn't have that same forward driving weight as the Warrior O or single-edged blades. because the material that would have been used to add weight to the blade to reinforce the spine is in turn drawn out into the second edge. So, what kind of sword would I suggest a witcher use? Now, I actually have with me an analog for a great sword sized blade, which I will be getting in a moment. The good thing about this microphone is that I can talk and still get good audio quality, even if I'm not directly facing the camera. This is a wooden sword that I'm in the process of making, but it gives us an analog for how these swords were used. And this is a technique you'll see many times in their treatises. This technique of keeping the blade in motion. Now, it is true that this thing is far lighter than even my lightest steel sword. I mean, look at this shit. I'm holding it with one finger. But that's not the point in this instance. And I really wish I had round off the corners of this bastard. But again, not the point here. The point is that these great swords, the Zweihander, the Claymore, the Kriegsmesser, all these great swords of Europe were about as tall as this, weighed somewhere around, I want to say anywhere between 6 and 10 pounds, which 10 pounds would have been the absolute heaviest that a great sword would have been feasibly able to be made. Other than anything above that, and it's just impractical as fuck. But in any case, because of these weapons and their size, these very flamboyant fighting styles were developed where we constantly spin, constantly stab our roofs, constantly spin, constantly keep in motion, constantly, uh, use the momentum of our weapons to keep it going. Now, with that in mind, you may be wondering, Outlaw, if you find that the Witcher's using the long sword is not the best weapon, but why? And I said so. It's because of the weight of the sword's blade. It's the mass distribution. This sword is more focused, its weight is more focused in the hand, which makes it very nimble and has excellent point control. However, its point control makes it suffer in its cutting capacity. This will never be able to cut through as sturdy or as thick a target as easily as the Warrior O's thicker, more robust blade. And I believe since the Witchers have augmented strength, stamina, durability, all that, they actually should be using slightly heavier, slightly bigger swords than your average human in their world. Now, I'd be amiss to not mention single-handed swords, one-handed blades. Outlaw, what do you think of witchers using one-handed swords? Well, one-handed swords generally do have more of a blade presence. However, one-handed swords are generally best used when in conjunction with a shield or a secondary weapon, such as a parrying dagger, or pretend this is like a full-on shield. Like, one-handed swords are generally best used in conjunction with a shield or another weapon of equivalent size or mass. Like if this was a mace, where you would slash, then smash, or then slash and smash, something like that. Now, Shadivercity makes a very valid point about the double-edged sword, is the versatility of this weapon. It does give you two blades, basically two edges to work with, versus a single-edged sword. But arguably, I would argue that against monster, and I made this very clear in the other video, that witchers, they really need to adopt two separate fighting styles. A fighting style where you would fight against men in against intelligent opponents using weapons, as in soldiers, and the non-intelligent monsters that that a witcher would usually face. Because here's the thing, witchers generally, usually, are always fighting against monsters. They don't really fight against humans or human level intellected opponents, such as the dwarves or the elves. And because of this difference, the Witcher can use his more flamboyant fighting style, especially in a group where, let's say, there's a necker here, a necker there, a necker there, and a necker there. Which, calm down, those are actual monsters from in-game universe. I'm not saying any kind of slur. But basically, if I'm surrounded by 4 different neckers, and one comes at me, I can slash, 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 slash. Or slash, 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 slash. Or you get the gist. Basically something like that. Because they don't have weapons. And I'm assuming because they are a fish-like species, they have relatively thin skin. So I don't assume it would take very much to do critical damage to a necker. And that would be the same with the ghouls and pretty much any other monster, where the monster's only real weapons are their claws, their fangs, or any other striking appendage on their body. And a good swift cut to the back of the leg will end the bipedal threats. Because swift slash to the neck, swift slash to the back of the knee or leg, they fall to their knees, and you're already in a position where, if you have the skill, talent, and ability to aim with the physical strength to do it, one-handed decap. Now, I am not going to stand here and say that the Witcher should change their entire fighting style. No. The Witchers have a fighting style that works for them in the context of what they're fighting. If you were to put a swordsman in a room full of unarmed MMA fighters, and you told this swordsman, kill these 4 MMA fighters, well, you've already, just with the fact that you have a sword, you've immediately put yourself in a position where all the advantage in the fight is yours. You basically have complete and total advantage in this fight. You can do whatever you want. They literally can't do anything to stop you. Alright? Because as soon as one closes in, not only do you have a fairly obvious reach advantage, blade and everything, but yeah, your opponent has bare fists, you have a blade. Just slash and you've already recovered. Now, you can say that they can jump you all at once. Let's say all 4 MMA fighters decide, we're just going to jump this fool. Well, you could always resort to the old helicopter of death. And while, generally speaking, something like this isn't really considered a technique, it actually kind of is. Because just the act of doing this not only will give you the ability to create space between you and your opponent, basically increasing the measure between the two of you, which measure is basically the distance between you, your weapon, your opponent's weapon, and him. And being able to understand distance and measure is everything in an actual sword duel, whether it's with swords, with spears, with halberds, with warhammers, whatever weapon. Even with guns, there's measure with guns as well. Measure usually doesn't really matter with guns because most gunfights are happening within a distance where it's really all about aiming. You don't really have to worry about your bullet not reaching your opponent. But still, this is a very important thing to understand, that just because the swordsman does this, it's still a viable technique. You're still creating distance between you and your opponent. And also, it lets you see where everyone is. Alright? If if the fighter on the left is coming to attack me, and I do the helicopter of death, I can see that, okay, he's closest, he's furthest away, he's somewhere in the middle, and he's almost right on my ass. It gives me basically the ability to see the entire battlefield. In this battlefield is a bit of a stretch, but work with me here. It lets me see the entire battlefield around me in one go, so I can say, once I've done my helicopter of death. And here's the thing, as I'm coming back around, I know generally you wouldn't thrust like this, but you can thrust and kind of perform a push cut on the fighter that you feel is either the closest to you or the one that's the most of a threat. So, helicopter of death, transfer into a thrust. So, just because we see these flamboyant, over-the-top movements don't necessarily think that the Witcher's fighting style wouldn't work. The Witcher's fighting style works perfectly well against unarmed opponents where you really don't have to worry about getting stabbed or cut because they don't have any weapons on them. Against armed opponents, yes, the Witcher's fighting style does leave some room to be desired. I said that in the previous video. I wish that they would have like a separate move set for when you're fighting against humans. Now, you can, if you hold down one of the buttons on your left side, you can like block an opponent's attack. And if you hit the X or Y button at the right time while you're blocking, you can perform like some sort of secret power move, I guess. But my thought process is, why make sure this bloody thing's still on? Why would you use the fighting style you'd use for unarmed opponents against armed opponents? That's what I want to know. 21 minutes. Huh. I'm actually having a lot more coherent thought than I actually thought I would. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. You've probably been screaming this the entirety of the video. Outlaw, the Witchers don't use katana sword. Well, yes. However, there are swords in the game, in the Witcher game, that are single-edged that you can use. And I'm guilty of using the single-edged swords for the longest time. And my excuse was, it's the closest thing I'm going to find to a katana without having to go through the process of downloading a mod. Yeah, you saw this orange scabbard in the background, so very astute viewers of my channel would know that, oh hell, he gonna get the Kriegsmesser out. Yes. In terms of the sword that I think would best suit the Witcher's fighting style, it is actually a falchion or a Kriegsmesser. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, but he needs to give up the versatility of having a second edge. Not necessarily. You can have a sharpened false edge on a Kriegsmesser or a falchion. But it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the video. A single-edged blade generally has more mass up towards the tip than a double-edged sword. And if I'm going to be fighting, if I was a Witcher and I was going to have to fight these monsters that I don't know how tough their skin is, I don't know how thick their bones are, how fibrous their muscles are, all these things. Now, obviously, you're going to say, well, he would learn all that at Kaer Morhen, or the Witcher schools would teach him. Yes, but there's a difference between just telling somebody, hey, these neckers have thin skin, semi-hard bones, and slightly tough flesh, versus them actually going out and cutting down a necker. You know, now that I say, you know, once you say neckers out loud, I can kind of see where if you really don't pronounce it fully, it could lead to some trouble. But yeah. Now, the reason I say falchions and Kriegsmessers is because The Witcher is based in a medieval Europe style world. And their predominant sword culture is European. Now, Europeans also, it's little known fact that you really don't hear about outside of Kriegsmessers and falchions, but the Europeans actually had a very long history of single-edged swords, just as much as they did long swords. It's just that in the end, the long sword dominated Europe more than single-edged blades. Single-edged swords in Europe actually for the longest time were actually seen as more of a commoner's weapon, mainly because their blades were much easier to produce in mass. It's much easier to produce a single-edged sword than it is to forge a long sword. Because with a single-edged blade, all you really have to do is make sure that both sides of the sword itself are relatively even and the blade is straight. With a double-edged sword, you have to make sure that there's actually 4 faces on a double-edged sword. Single-edged swords only have 3. 1, 2, 3. Put that down and hopefully don't chip the hell out of the blade. Double-edged swords, on the other hand, have 1, 2, 3, 4 faces. So that's almost double the amount of attention to detail you have to have in order to forge a sword. Now, obviously, the European hilt construction method is very simplistic. Guard, grip, pommel, peen. And you're done. You have yourself a fully assembled sword. Now, the Kriegsmesser, for example, has a bit more of a complicated construction method, I'll admit, because you have crossguard, noggle, scale, grip scale, pin, 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 end cap. Sometimes full-on pommel, that's peen. Sometimes no end cap. Sometimes no pommel. If I was to take this sword and give it this, if I was to take the Kriegsmesser's blade and put it on the hand and a half sword's hilt, I'd have a falchion. That's the only difference between a falchion and a Kriegsmesser is grip construction. Even if I was to include the noggle, it would still be a falchion because of grip construction. But in any case, like I said, these single-edged swords, they have more mass in their blades, and they're balanced in a way that facilitates the cut. It facilitates the cut, and it also facilitates gravity. Because more mass is in the blade, meaning the weight is more up here, it acts similar to hammers, in a sense. Where when you swing a hammer and it glances off, it still wants to go down. So basically, if you hammer something and it glances off, it still wants to go down. Same principle here. You cut down, and because the weight of the sword is going this way, you're able to recover quicker. Because at this point, it takes less energy to simply turn the grip in your hands and turn your wrists than it does to cut down, stop it, and bring it back up. It's much more efficient to do that. Now, I will say that there's one problem with doing this, and that is actually at the point where you start to spin the blade actually loses its edge alignment. So if you cut something and you have to turn and cut something over here, well, the edge is facing down and you need to bring it completely back up to cut. Now, some would argue that this is where the double-edged sword would thrive, because you can just false edge cut. Well, if you had a sharpened false edge on a Kriegsmesser, false edge cut. Or you could also just forbade having, you could also completely ignore bringing the sword back up for a cut, and instead one fluent motion I need to get some 3-in-1 oil and clean this guard. It's starting to rust. But yeah, with one fluent motion, go from cut to thrust. Now, obviously, if this was meant to be used in a Witcher's hands, the grip would be longer. That's the one thing I can't really stand about this sword. It's short, little, stubby grip. That's the one thing about this Kriegsmesser, aside from its rusting issues, which I've pretty much solved, that I hate. Now, this sword, on the other hand, is much better at doing that. Now, as we can see, this is a much thicker blade, but still. Same thing. You can still perform that same false edge cut with a sword like this. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I do favor katana over most other swords. It's just a thing with me. However, I will also admit that if I could take this sword's blade and put it on this sword's hilt with a different pommel, honestly, I'd have my dream sword, because honestly, I imagine my dream sword being somewhere in a mix between a falchion and a katana. But that's just me, trying to keep on to the subject of The Witcher. Now, in conclusion, after demonstrating these techniques in a little bit wider of an area, we can get a very good, very concise kind of understanding of The Witcher's combat style as a whole. It is very flamboyant, it is very elegant, to say the least, but it is also has its impracticalities. And honestly, all sword styles, all combat styles. They have their impracticalities, and they have their practicalities. For example, as we see here, once I've adjusted the belt, as we just saw, the katana's very famous Sayabiki EI draw, while it does generally look cool, and you can surprise your opponent, because most of the time, I would say your opponent's not really expecting you to use any EI techniques against them. Honestly, most judicial sword duels will have begun with both opponents already with both combatants already having their blades drawn. But street fights are a different thing. You have to draw your blade quickly. This sword really wouldn't be a blade I would use on the street. I would actually take the Dragon King Winter Sun katana in a street fight over this, just because the Dragon King Winter Sun is lighter and easier to draw than this behemoth. This was not made for EI at all. This was made for just lopping through pretty much anything that gets in front of it. But yeah, the Witcher style does have its ups, it does have its downs, but then again, all martial arts has those. There is no perfect martial art. If there was, everyone in the world would learn it, everyone would know exactly how to counter their moves. They would know exactly which technique to use which, like, oh, he's cutting down, I have to block like this and cut like this, or he's cutting like this, well, I have to block and then parry like this, or something like that. The Witcher's style is perfectly suited to the kind of opponents he is generally going to fight. Unarmed monsters that rely on their physical strength and pretty much nothing else to win the fight. Like, they'll just attack you with whatever they have on hand. Fucking, come on. Stupid ass light. But yeah. So, this has been going on for almost 40 damn minutes. Sheesh. Yeah, this is going. I'm going to have to put a drink and snack warning in this video. So until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all, be crazy rednecks, be safe in using your weapons, and may you stay on the path. Happy witchering to you all. I'm out. Peace.